Amy Schulz, 10, left her home in Kell, Illinois, on a warm summer evening in 1987. Kell is a small town in Marion County, with a population of 231 at the time of the 2000 census. Amy was the youngest and only girl of 3 children. Her father Dennis and stepmother Esther were overjoyed with her. Amy was going to find her older brother, who had been looking for the family dog, on this night in 1987. Amy decided to go find her brother and inform him that the search was over after Biscuit returned home. She never found her brother, so she began a new search, this time for Amy. Amy's parents and brothers began looking for her after her brother returned home without her. Residents in small southern Illinois towns like Kell left their doors unlocked and let their children play outside until the streetlights came on in 1987. The low crime rate gave residents a false sense of security. The "it couldn't happen here" mentality was in full swing. Until it happened in Kell. Amy Schulz, 10, vanished without a trace. Her body was discovered face down in a field the next morning, July 2nd. The community's innocence had been shattered. Amy was discovered only 8 miles from Kell. The residents of the small village and surrounding communities were devastated. I'm not sure if larger communities understand this, but when something like this happens in a small community, it doesn't happen to someone, it happens to your neighbor, a close friend, your child's schoolmate, or a student in your Sunday school class. People are very close here. We have to rely on ourselves for support and security, Rhea Ellen Alvis, who organized a neighborhood watch group, said. The crime scene yielded some preliminary evidence, such as shoe prints on Amy's back and a pool of blood beneath her head. Because the blood did not cover other parts of her body, the pool of blood indicated that she was killed where she was discovered. Fibers were collected from the scene in Amy's buttocks, as well as 2 male pubic hairs. Police discovered tire impressions and cast shoe prints near her remains. The autopsy revealed more information about how the young girl was murdered. Amy had a 14.5 centimeters wound that ran from her throat to behind her right ear lobe. Her carotid and jugular arteries had been severed because her throat had been slashed so deeply. Her right eye was hemorrhaged, her left eye was abraded, her ear was ripped off, and her lips were lacerated from being compressed under her teeth. Amy also had severe bruising and genital abrasions. Amy was hospitalized with 3 subdural hematomas, a broken rib, a bruised esophagus, and bleeding vocal cords. Her liver was lacerated. Her rectum had been torn, and pubic hairs were discovered, indicating that she had been molested. Amy died as a result of homicidal violence, according to the medical examiner. The autopsy revealed that she had been strangled unconscious, anally penetrated, and her throat slit. As if that wasn't enough, the killer stepped on her back, forcing blood to leave her body faster. Based on her stomach contents, the coroner estimated her death time to be between 9:30 and 11 p.m. on July 1st. This means Amy was kidnapped and murdered shortly after leaving her house around 9 p.m. Kell's population dropped dramatically, and the town was almost deserted. Playgrounds were deserted, and children were kept indoors. Citizens were terrified as they grappled with the reality of what had occurred in their own neighborhood. During the first 3 months of the investigation, police followed up on over 500 leads. Sadly, they were unable to identify a suspect during this time period. Forensic experts determined that the tire prints found near the body were consistent with only 2 North American tires. The tire prints matched Cooper, Falls Persuader, and Cooper, Dean Polaris, models. The shoe prints were also determined to be from a Kmart exclusive boot called the Texas Steer. Police had only 2 solid leads, but they couldn't connect them to a suspect. The information was entered into VICAP, the FBI's Violent Crimes Apprehension Unit, in the hopes of identifying a suspect. In October 1987, park rangers at Minnesota's Glacier National Park were attacked, prompting the FBI to intervene. An alleged sniper had fired 4 shots in one day. There were no fatalities, but there were injuries. When the FBI got involved, shots were fired at them as well. One park ranger was shot in the abdomen after a bullet passed through his truck door, bounced off his steering wheel, and struck him. Federal agents apprehended the man, who had been camping in the park for 10 days, and arrested him. Cecil Sutherland, a 32-year-old man from Dix, Illinois, was his name. During Sutherland's arrest, FBI agents noticed that his vehicle had a single Cooper Falls Persuader tire on the right front wheel, which matched the VICAP description. He also had a pair of Texas steer boots on him. With this information, police launched an investigation into Cecil Sutherland. Cecil was living with his mother in Dix, Illinois, just a few miles from where Amy's remains were discovered, at the time of her death. His brother, in fact, lived less than a mile from the crime scene. Police were able to obtain a search warrant for Sutherland's vehicle, tires, and boots as a result of this. While the investigation was ongoing, Cecil Sutherland pleaded guilty to attempted murder in the sniper case in federal court and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was transferred to Kansas Fort Leavenworth to serve his federal sentence. Sutherland also met with investigators, who said they were working on a case in southern Illinois. Mr. Sutherland responded, "I know exactly where I was on July 1st, which authorities interpreted as evidence of guilt." Sutherland then put an end to the interview. Forensic experts compared Sutherland's vehicle tire and his boots to crime scene impressions. The experts determined that the tire impressions and shoe prints were consistent with Cecil Sutherland, but they could not say that it was an exclusive match. Another expert determined that the tire impressions were the same size and model as Cecil's tire, with consistent wear patterns. While not conclusive, this circumstantial evidence was damning. Hairs and fibers found on Amy and her clothing were also tested by forensics. Some of the hairs were identified as being from a dog. They compared these hairs to those of Amy's dog Biscuit and other family dogs, who were all inconsistent. They then compared the dog hairs to Cecil Sutherland's black lab. According to family members, Cecil frequently traveled in his vehicle with his dog, leaving hair behind. Sutherland was further indicted because the hairs were consistent with the black lab. Amy's fibers and clothing were compared to the interior of Cecil Sutherland's vehicle. The fibers in this study were consistent with the fibers on the vehicle's interior. Additionally, fibers consistent with Amy's clothing were collected inside the vehicle. Although DNA testing was not yet available, the two pubic hairs found on Amy's buttocks were compared to Cecil Sutherland's pubic hair sample. The expert concluded that the hairs matched Sutherland and were not a match for any of Amy's family members or neighbors who provided samples. Cecil Sutherland was charged with Amy Schulz's murder based on this evidence. 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of aggravated criminal sexual assault, and 1 count of aggravated kidnapping were among the charges. The legal proceedings began in October 1988. Increased security was present during court hearings, and the citizens of southern Illinois were outraged. Many verbal threats were made against Sutherland, according to law enforcement. The general public desired his head on a stick. In May of 1989, the trial officially began. Dennis, Amy's father, sobbed in court as he recalled the horror he felt when his daughter's body was discovered in 1987. He remembered crying out, "Not my Amy," over and over again. Despite living only a few miles apart, Dennis testified that he had never met Sutherland before. "Until Amy was murdered, I had no idea animals like that existed," he continued. The trial continued with forensic experts testifying. The defense moved to exclude the search warrants and their findings from evidence, but the motion was denied. Sutherland, according to the defense, was at his brother and sister in-house laws on the night of the crime, which was only a half-mile away from the crime scene. Sutherland was at Amy's house between 8 and 8:30 p.m., according to his sister in testimony. Laws. Sutherland's mother testified that he called her around 11 p.m. from a Mount Vernon gas station because his car had broken down. She arrived around 11:30 p.m. to pick him up. According to the prosecution, this gave him plenty of time to commit the crime, but the defense argued that he wouldn't have had time to abduct her, kill her, clean up himself and his vehicle, and get to Mount Vernon. The defense also worked against the fibers and hairs. Each of these is essentially a zero in terms of connecting Cecil Stephen Sutherland to these crimes, and even if you add them up or multiply them, you still get zero, defense attorney James Henson stated. The prosecution claimed that the fibers and hairs discovered proved that Cecil Sutherland murdered Amy. They were a match, according to the prosecution. After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict on May 24, 1989. Cecil Sutherland was convicted on all charges. Prosecutors announced that the death penalty would be sought. "I believe he deserves the maximum penalty the law allows," Amy's stepmother, Esther Schulz, said. The prosecution referred to Cecil Sutherland as a vile killer and a sexually perverted sadist during the penalty phase of the trial. The defense called 4 witnesses, including Sutherland's mother and friends. They described him as a pretty good guy in their testimony. Cecil Sutherland was sentenced to death after the jury determined that the aggravating circumstances outweighed the mitigating circumstances. Dennis Schulz wished to assist children who had been victims of sexual abuse and violent crimes. In 1990, he used his grief to create and open the Amy Schulz Child Advocacy Center. The Mount Vernon, Illinois-based center provides a safe haven for children who have suffered sexual or severe physical abuse. The board, staff, and members of the multidisciplinary team collaborate to provide intervention, prevention, education, and advocacy services in the best interests of abused children. The center is still open in Mount Vernon and Carlisle, Illinois. Cecil Sutherland's appeal was heard by the Illinois Supreme Court in 2000, as part of the automatic appeal process associated with death penalty cases. According to the defense, the prosecution presented the forensic evidence, hairs and fibers, as a conclusive match to Sutherland. The court agreed that this was deceptive because the evidence was consistent but not conclusive. Furthermore, the court agreed that the original defense attorney failed to present all evidence in Sutherland's favor, including Sutherland's claim that he purchased the boots after the crime. The conviction and sentence were overturned by the court, and Cecil Sutherland was remanded for a new trial. The prosecution could still present the fibers and hairs as evidence in the second trial, but they could not portray them as conclusive evidence of guilt. However, the state could conduct additional testing on the evidence, such as DNA analysis. To avoid jury bias in the small community, the second trial was moved to St. Clair County. This time, DNA evidence was used to match the hairs to Cecil Sutherland. This time, the fiber evidence was presented as being consistent with Sutherland, avoiding the same blunder. During the second trial, the defense presented an alternate suspect, Amy Schulz's stepfather, Bill Willis. Bill Willis, who lived only 100 yards away from the Schulzes, had been convicted of child molestation. Amy's brother testified at Willis's sentencing hearing that his stepfather molested all 3 Schulz children, including Amy. The defense claimed that this created reasonable doubt and suggested that Willis was the murderer. Bill Willis testified, denying ever molested Amy and never killing her. He did, however, confess to sexually abusing at least 4 boys. "I've never forced any child to do anything," he said. He further stated, "I made them think it was their idea, and I was never attracted to females." Bill, on the other hand, had been the last person to see Amy before her kidnapping, as she walked past his house on her way to find her brother. Bill was a former martial arts instructor, which the defense claimed was consistent with the wounds that suffocated Amy. Willis was also friends with the lead investigator in this case, according to the defense. Evidence, however, showed that Bill Willis was at work at the time Amy was murdered. The jury in Cecil Sutherland's second trial had a lot more to think about when they were deliberating. Cecil Sutherland was found guilty on all counts by the jury once more, demonstrating the strength of the forensic evidence in this case. The defense made an announcement as the jury returned to begin the sentencing phase. Cecil Sutherland had chosen to be executed, and the judge granted his request. Although it may appear that Sutherland was finally admitting guilt, he also benefited from accepting the death penalty. He was now eligible to receive funds from the Capital Defense Litigation Fund to help pay for his appeals process. Cases involving the death penalty are also automatically appealed. Cecil would be separated from the general population on death row. This aided him because he was concerned about his safety in prison. Sutherland is still incarcerated as of 2023, and is currently housed at the Shawnee Correctional Center. The death penalty was abolished in the state of Illinois in 2011. Sutherland was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. He continues to appeal his case, claiming that evidence in his case should have been suppressed, but has so far been unsuccessful. What are your thoughts on the Amy Schulz's case? I really appreciate your input. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Be a part of the Chris Crime Diaries family and hit the subscribe button now.